She was lying face down in Afghan dirt when they found her, left shoulder soaked through, blood dark and steady against the tan of her uniform. The kind of wound that made experienced men go quiet because experienced men knew what that color meant and what that volume meant, and they knew that a person losing that much had a narrow window before the window closed for good. But her right hand was not shaking. Her right hand was pressed flat against the inner thigh of a man twice her size, holding pressure on a tourniquet she had applied in the dark by feel alone in the middle of a firefight while people were actively trying to kill her. And her voice, low and hurried, carrying just far enough to reach the men around her, was issuing instructions with the calm precision of someone reading from a manual they had memorized a long time ago and never once forgotten. 10 o'clock, 40 meters. He's moving left. The man she was treating turned his head toward her voice the way injured men do when they have nothing left to hold on to but sound. "You're okay," she told him. Not a question, not comfort. A statement of fact delivered by someone who had already decided it was true and was not in the habit of deciding things she did not intend to follow through on. Later, when the SEAL medics from the QRF helicopter stepped out onto that rocky ground and saw what they were looking at, this small, blood-soaked woman with her hands still working, still focused, still in complete control of everything within her reach, one of them would spend a long time trying to describe what he saw in her face. He never quite got it right. The closest he ever came was this: she looked like someone who had just finished something her father started. She was smiling. Her name was Tessa Calloway. She was 26 years old. She stood 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed 122 pounds on a good day, which this was not. She held the rank of Hospital Corpsman Second Class in the United States Navy, and she had been attached to SEAL Team 3 Task Unit Bravo at Forward Operating Base Wright in Kunar Province, Afghanistan, for exactly 11 days before everything you are about to hear happened. 11 days. Remember that number. Because in 11 days, Tessa Calloway had gone from being the woman nobody on that team wanted anywhere near the front of anything to the only reason half of them came home at all. This is how that happened. FOB Wright sat in the Kunar River Valley like something the mountains had reluctantly agreed to tolerate. It was a serious place. The kind of base where men did not raise their voices unnecessarily and did not make jokes that required explanation. The surrounding terrain, steep, folded, deeply shadowed, even in full sun, had a way of reminding everyone who passed through it that this particular corner of the earth had been eating soldiers for centuries and had developed a taste for it. It was late September of 2011. The war was 10 years old. The men of Task Unit Bravo had been running operations in this valley long enough that they no longer needed to look at maps to know where the danger lived. They carried it in their bodies now, in the way they moved through a room, in the way they scanned a ridgeline without being told to, in the particular quality of stillness they achieved when something felt wrong, a stillness so complete and so practiced that it had become a language between them, readable only by those who spoke it. Tessa Calloway arrived on a resupply flight on a Tuesday morning. She came off the ramp with her kit squared, her face neutral, and her eyes moving not anxiously, not obviously, but in the systematic way her father had taught her before she was old enough to understand what the system was for. Left to right, near to far, continuous and unhurried, the way you read a landscape when you need to know what it contains before it decides to show you. Nobody on the flight line was looking at her eyes. They were looking at everything else. She was aware of this. She had been aware of it since the day she enlisted, since Field Medical Training Battalion, since every field exercise and deployment workup, where men had decided before she opened her mouth what she was and what she wasn't. She did not take it personally. She did not waste energy on it. She simply noted it, filed it, and moved on the way she did with all information that was real, but not immediately actionable. Her assigned space was a converted storage room at the eastern end of the medical station. She unpacked with the efficiency of someone who had done it in worse places and would do it in worse places still. Uniform, kit, tools, the small folded photograph she placed face up on the surface beside her bunk, without ceremony because she had no ceremony left about it, an only habit, and beneath the habit something so constant she had long since stopped feeling its edges. The man in the photograph was tall, wide-shouldered in the way that makes civilian spaces look scaled wrong. He was not smiling because he did not smile easily, but there was something in the set of his jaw that Tessa had spent her life learning to read, and what it said to her at least was, "I know something you don't yet. I'm going to enjoy watching you figure it out." Gunnery Sergeant Raymond Calloway, United States Marine Corps, Force Recon, killed in action, Kunar Province, Afghanistan, April 2007. She was 21 when they came to the door. 21 when she stood in the hallway of the house she grew up in and watched her mother's face change in a way that faces don't come back from. And 21 when she made a promise, not to anyone, just to herself, standing in that hallway, in that silence, that she was done. Done with all of it. The guns, the distance, the particular loneliness of loving someone who lives closer to death than to you. She had broken that promise. She was still working out how she felt about that. Chief Harlan Voss found her 40 minutes after her arrival. He was 51 years old and had been doing this for 28 years, which meant he had learned to see things other people missed, not because he was smarter, but because he had been wrong enough at times to become very careful. He came around the corner of the medical station and found her crouched beside a supply crate, running a function check on her M9 with the rote confidence of someone who had performed this action 10,000 times. He watched her hands, left hand holding the frame, right hand running the slide. Standard. Clean. And then, just for a moment there and gone, her right index finger drifted to the edge of the trigger guard. Not inside, just to the edge of it, a pause of perhaps half a second before she caught it and brought it back. Muscle memory, old and deeply specific. Voss knew the difference between someone who had handled weapons as part of a boa and someone who had grown up with them as part of a life. The difference was not speed or precision, though both might be present. The difference was intimacy. The way the hands knew the weight before the mind finished thinking about it. The way the body accommodated the object as though it had always belonged there. He introduced himself, gave her the standard orientation information in the standard amount of time, and left. But he did not stop thinking about what he had seen. The team was not unkind to her. This needs to be said plainly because what developed between them in those first days was not cruelty. These were professional men operating under serious pressure in a serious environment, and what they felt about Tessa Calloway was not contempt. It was something more structural than that, something built into the architecture of how they had learned to think about people and roles, and the non-negotiable question of who you could count on when everything else fell away, and the only thing between alive and dead was the person standing next to you. They had their answer to that question. They had tested it across years and deployments and more firefights than most of them counted anymore. They knew who could perform under the weight of it. Tessa Calloway was new. She was small. She was a medic. These were professional facts, entirely understandable, and they shaped the way the team related to her with a consistency she absorbed without reaction, because she had expected exactly this and because reaction would have cost her something she intended to keep. P.O. 2-Stitch Briggs was the one who said what most of them were thinking. He said it in the briefing room on her second day when Lieutenant Dermot Cahill was walking through the operational parameters for an upcoming mission and assigning positions. Briggs sat to her left with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who had been doing this long enough to have opinions about most things and the confidence to share them. "Doc stays rear," he said, not to her specifically, to the room. "No offense?" Lieutenant Cahill did not disagree. He was a careful man who respected the judgment of his experienced people, and his experienced people had spoken. Tessa wrote something in her small notebook. Nobody saw what it was. The second moment happened on the third day during a foot reconnaissance through a section of valley floor that the team needed to map for a future operation. The terrain shifted constantly in this part of Kunar loose shale, giving way to compacted soil, giving way to dry riverbed. Each transition carrying its own tactical implications, its own set of considerations about cover and the physics of what a bullet does through different densities of ground. The team moved through it with practiced efficiency, and Tessa moved with them, maintaining her interval, carrying her kit, doing nothing that drew attention, except that she was looking at something. PO3. Cody Reeves noticed it because Reeves noticed most things. He was 24 years old and still in that phase of his career where vigilance felt like a competition he needed to win. She was looking at the ground, but not the way you look at ground when you're watching your footing. She was reading it, moving her eyes in a pattern that was slow and systematic. "What are you looking at, Doc?" he asked. She answered without looking up. "Wind." Reeves looked at the ground around her boots. He looked back at her face. He glanced at Briggs, who had caught the exchange, and Briggs returned a fractional shrug that communicated everything it needed to without a word. That night in the team room, Briggs made a comment he would later spend considerable effort regretting. He directed it at Eli Trant, the newest and youngest member of the team, in the tone of a man who thought he was being funny and had not fully considered who was within earshot. Chief Voss was in the corner of the room, cleaning equipment, his back partly turned. He did not speak. He simply stopped what he was doing and looked at Briggs. Just looked. The way a man looks when he has decided that silence delivered with sufficient precision accomplishes more than any sentence he might construct. Briggs stopped talking. Tessa, who had heard everything from the hallway and chosen not to enter the room, walked back to the medical station and sat on her bunk and looked at her father's photograph for a long time without speaking. The fourth day brought heat that the valley collected and concentrated until it felt less like weather and more like a deliberate condition. 4 hours into a movement toward a staging area, Tessa noticed Ely Trant's gait change. It was subtle, a slight favoring of the right leg that was not mechanical but neurological, the kind of compensation the body makes when the brain is working harder than it should have to, just to manage basic locomotion. She watched him for 8 minutes. She noted the frequency of his blinking, the small delay between input and response when Cahill called his name, the quality of his eyes when she was finally close enough to see them clearly tracking half-second behind where they should have been. 3 days earlier, a controlled detonation in the southern sector had produced a pressure wave that rolled through the base perimeter. Trant had been close enough that he should have been assessed. He had not reported it because he was 22 years old and had not yet developed the wisdom to understand that the things you don't report have a way of reporting themselves at the worst possible time. She moved up alongside him without announcing herself. Trant, he turned. The delay was present. When did the headache start? He opened his mouth to tell her he didn't have one. Don't, she said quietly. When? A pause, then this morning, maybe last night. She took his pulse, put her palm briefly against the side of his neck, reading the heat there. She asked 4 questions in a specific sequence, and the small hesitations inside his answers told her what she needed to confirm. You're done walking, she said. She radioed Cahill with the assessment in 30 seconds heat stroke, compounding a probable mild TBI from the blast exposure 3 days prior. Not an emergency yet, approaching one. She needed 12 minutes to stabilize. Cahill halted the movement. Briggs stood with his arms crossed and watched her work on Trant with the expression of a man keeping his opinions strictly to himself. She did not look at him. She opened her kit with the focused economy that comes from having performed a thing enough times that thought is no longer the rate-limiting step. And she treated Trant with the efficiency of someone who understood that speed and precision were not competing values but the same value wearing different faces. 12 minutes. Trant stabilized. The movement resumed. Cahill looked at her once before he turned back to the front. A brief look, the kind of man gives when he is updating his assessment of someone and replacing an earlier entry with a more accurate one. Briggs said, "Lucky call." He said it with enough conviction to almost believe it himself. Tessa did not respond. Voss, 3 positions back watching all of it, allowed himself the smallest of smiles. He had served with Raymond Calloway for 2 tours and recognized many things in the way this woman worked the economy of motion, the refusal to explain herself, the complete indifference to whether anyone was impressed. He recognized all of it, and the recognition sat in his chest with a weight he was not yet ready to name aloud. He had been waiting 4 years to meet this woman. He was not yet ready to tell her why. The mission briefing came on the 5th day, called for 1,400 hours. It had the tone of briefings that matter, that compress quality of attention in a room full of people who have learned that missing a detail costs something that cannot be returned. Lieutenant Dermot Cahill stood at the front with maps and imagery and a targeting package, and he laid it out with the clean precision of a man who understood that clarity in a briefing room is not a courtesy, but a tactical necessity. The target was a man named Commander Rashid Karimi. The file described him as a senior Taliban commander operating in the Nawabad North District of Kunar Province, responsible for a series of IED attacks over 8 months that had killed 7 Americans and wounded 14 more. Maintained a network of operatives providing intelligence on coalition movements. Capture or kill, strong preference for capture. The file described a lot of things. Cahill walked through the operational parameters, routes, timing, contingencies. Tessa sat 2 rows back and wrote because writing was a habit her father had installed early, the understanding that retention under stress degrades faster than people expect, and that paper does not forget what the brain drops. She was writing when Cahill said the words Nawabad North. Her pen stopped. 1 second of stillness. Then the hand resumed as though nothing had interrupted it, but Voss was 2 seats to her left, and he saw it. He understood it in a way that required no explanation because he had known for days that this moment was coming, and he had been deciding for days what he intended to do when it arrived. The briefing continued. A DIA officer named Major Whitford had joined via secure video link, and when Cahill completed the standard operational overview, Whitford leaned slightly toward his camera and said he had something to add. His face had the controlled quality of someone who had spent years in rooms where showing too much was his own kind of vulnerability. Commander Rashid Karimi was not a Taliban commander. He had never been a Taliban commander. He was a former brigadier general in Pakistan's Inner Services Intelligence Directorate, officially removed from the ISY's active roles in 2004, officially being the operative word because officially in that part of the world had a relationship with actually that was negotiable at best. Karimi had continued operating in the network's shadows, penetrating coalition intelligence structures at 3 separate levels. And for the past 8 months, the 8 months during which 7 Americans had died, he had been providing Taliban strike teams with advanced intelligence on patrol routes, movement timings, and the operational parameters of missions, exactly like the one they were about to execute. The IED strikes were not opportunistic. They were choreographed. Every one of them had targeted a movement that was supposed to be secure. Everyone had been placed at a location requiring advanced knowledge. Someone had been feeding that knowledge to Karimi, and Karimi had been using it to design deaths that looked like war but functioned like assassination. "You're not hunting a Taliban commander," Whitford said. "You're disrupting an intelligence network. Karimi is the node. You remove him, the web collapses or activates. Either way, the operational landscape changes significantly after tonight." The room was quiet in the way rooms go quiet when information restructures everything already decided. Tessa wrote nothing during this portion of the briefing. She was not taking notes because she did not need to. She was listening with a particular quality of attention, still absolute pointed inward, because this information was intersecting with something she had been carrying for 4 years, and the intersection required everything available to process correctly. Nawabad North. She had known that name before she stepped off the resupply flight. She had known it before she requested this assignment, before she finished her corpsman training, before any of the official paperwork that had eventually brought her here. She knew it the same way she knew the weight of a Remington 700 in her hands, not from reading, but from being taught deliberately and specifically by someone who understood the difference between knowledge that lives in the mind and knowledge that lives in the body. Her father had operated in Nawabad North. His last deployment, April 2007. For reasons that his official record described in language too vague to mean anything and too specific to be accidental. She had read that record 14 times. She had requested additional documents through the Freedom of Information Act and received pages blacked out in patterns that told her more than the remaining text. She had spent 4 years assembling a picture from its negative spaces. The picture showed her that her father had been in Nawabad North doing something that someone did not want documented, and that something had happened to him there, and nobody had ever told her what it was. She had come here to find out. Voss was watching her. He had been watching since Whitford said Nawabad North, and what he was watching was not surprise or fear, but something settling a decision that had already been made long before this room, sitting down into its final position with the quiet certainty of a round chambered in a rifle already aimed. He looked away before she could catch him. He had 4 years of information that she did not have. He had to decide what he was going to do with it. The briefing ended at 15:20 hours. The team dispersed to prepare. Tessa walked back to the medical station and sat on her bunk and did not reach for her notebook and did not look at her father's photograph. She looked at the wall instead, at the yellowed paint in the small cracks where the structure had settled over years. She was thinking about Nawabad North. She was thinking about the promise made in a hallway at 21 years old and the fact that she had broken it and whether the reason was sufficient. Whether sufficient was even the right word or whether the right word was something older and less comfortable than that. From outside came the sounds of men preparing equipment being checked and rechecked, the clipped exchange of people who communicate in compressed language because every syllable costs something in the field and the habit follows them home. In 3 days, they would move on Nawabad North. She reached for the photograph, held it at arm's length the way you hold something you need to see clearly. She looked at the set of his jaw and the thing it had always said to her in the language she had spent her life learning to read. "I know something you don't yet." She set it down. She began to prepare. Outside, the Hindu Kush held its silence the way mountains do, without judgment, without preference, without any particular interest in what the small and brief creatures at its feet intended to do next. It had seen all of this before. It would see all of it again. But it had not yet seen Tessa Calloway walk 41 steps through what should have been the end of her. That part was still coming. They moved out on the third night, no moon worth mentioning. The darkness over the Kunar Valley had the density that comes from elevation and cloud cover, working together, a darkness so complete that the men of Task Unit Bravo move through it using the pale green world of their night vision and the accumulated spatial memory of operators who had walked enough bad ground to carry terrain in their bodies long after the maps were folded away. Tessa Calloway moved with them, assigned to the rear element, which was standard. She did not argue it, which was also standard by now. She maintained her interval and her silence and watched the ground the way her father had taught her, not point by point, which is how people exhaust themselves and start missing things, but in a continuous read, a rolling assessment that treated the earth as a document written in a language most people had simply forgotten how to speak. The route took them northeast out of the staging area across 2 kilometers of open valley floor, then into the folded terrain, pushing up toward Nawabad North. Elevation gain was steady, footing was technical in places. The team moved without lights and without unnecessary communication, because communication is noise, and noise is information, and information in this valley had a way of traveling to people you had no interest in informing. Chief Voss was third in the file. Tessa was sixth. Between them, Cody Reeves moved with the focused energy of someone who had decided that proving himself was the appropriate response to every situation useful in a young operator and simultaneously a quality requiring management. The ambush came at the 4 kilometer mark. It came from the eastern slope, which was the tactically obvious position and therefore the choice good planners make when they want a target to feel unlucky rather than anticipated. The fire was immediate and coordinated, not a probe, not a warning, but the real thing delivered with the confidence of people who knew exactly where the team would be and had arranged themselves accordingly. 3 things happened almost simultaneously. The team broke into their contact drill with the automatic efficiency of training so deep it had become reflex. Cahill's voice came over the radio in the clipped shorthand of a man who had been through enough of these to understand that panic is a resource expenditure that can never be recovered. And Cody Reeves went down. He went down on the right side of the trail, which put him in partial cover, and he went down hard. Not the stumble of someone who had lost their balance, but the collapse of someone whose leg had stopped being able to hold them. The distinction mattered because the two had very different implications for what needed to happen next. Tessa was moving before she finished processing what she was seeing. This is worth understanding, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was precisely the opposite. It was what happens when training becomes biology, when the response to a specific stimulus has been rehearsed so many times that the gap between perception and action effectively disappears. She did not decide to move. She moved. Her body understood what the situation required before her mind had finished reading it. She covered the distance in the time it takes to exhale. The wound was in the right thigh high and medial, and she knew what that meant before her hands confirmed it, because she had studied this wound specifically because her father had told her early and plainly that this was the one that killed fastest and left the smallest margin for deliberation. Femoral artery, tourniquet out and positioned in 4 seconds, applied and tightened in another 30. The entire sequence performed by feel in near total darkness, her hands knowing the geometry without requiring her eyes to verify each step, because she had practiced this, genuinely practiced it, not the classroom version, but the hands in the dark, clock running, nothing going right version until it had burned itself permanently into her nervous system. Reeves, talk to me. His voice came back thin but present. I'm here. Good. Stay here. I have you. She had him. What she did not have was a way to move him because the slope above them was still generating fire, and the eastern ridgeline held a secondary threat she had been cataloging since they entered this section of valley. A sniper. High on the eastern slope, approximately 840 meters out. She had not seen the muzzle flash directly, but the impact pattern of rounds coming into the team's position, their angle, their sequence, the specific geometry of where they were landing told her what she needed to know. The math was not complicated if you understood what you were reading, which she did. The sniper was keeping the team pinned, not randomly specifically preventing evacuation of Reeves to the casualty collection point 20 meters further back, where she could work on him properly. This was deliberate. Someone had planned the geometry of this carefully, which told her something important about how much of tonight had been known in advance by people who were not supposed to know it. She looked for Briggs. Briggs was the team's designated marksman. Under normal circumstances, he would have already identified the sniper position and would be in the process of solving it. He was the man built for exactly this moment. Briggs was on the ground to her left, with his right arm held at an angle that communicated everything she needed to know, without requiring him to say a word. Alive. Conscious. Right arm non-functional. The Barrett M82A1 was on the ground beside him. She looked at it. 30 pounds of precision machinery lying in the dirt of an Afghan hillside waiting. She looked at Reeves, whose face, in the pale green of her peripheral vision, had begun to take on the quality that faces take on when the body is working very hard to compensate for something it cannot compensate for indefinitely. She looked back at the Barrett. She crossed to it before the analytical part of her mind had finished building the argument for why this was necessary. The argument was simple. Reeves had minutes, not many, and the sniper was preventing his evacuation, and there was nobody else. Those were the facts. They did not require deliberation. She had the rifle up in the bipod deployed, and her eye behind the loopholed scope before the slope around her had finished registering that she had moved. The scope gave her the eastern slope in magnification, gray-green and textured, and she moved through it the way her father had taught her, not hunting for the target directly, which is how you miss it, but reading the environment around where the target had to be, because the environment always gives the position away to someone who knows what to look for. She found him. 840 meters. Slight upslope angle affecting bullet drop in a specific and calculable way. Wind from the northwest at 8 to 10 miles per hour, gusting intermittently, which was the variable requiring the most attention, because wind at that distance is not a constant problem, but an intermittent one, and intermittent problems kill the shot if you don't learn to wait for the right moment. She had been taught to breathe through this, not to suppress the breath, which is what people imagine when they think about long-range shooting, but to use it, to find the natural pause at the bottom of the exhale, where the body is momentarily still, where the heartbeat is momentarily predictable, where the variables that cannot be controlled have settled into their most manageable arrangement. She found the pause. She fired. The round went left. Less than 2 feet at that distance, which sounds like a small error, until you understand that 2 feet is the difference between a hit and a miss, and that at 840 meters, 2 feet means the wind shifted in the final third of the bullet's flight in a way she had not fully accounted for. She adjusted, not the scope. The scope was correctly set. She adjusted her rate of the wind because a strip of fabric tied to a branch 40 meters downrange had just told her something about the gust pattern she had partially misread. She updated her model of what was happening in the air between her and the target, and she waited for the pause again. It came. She fired. The target on the eastern slope stopped moving, 840 meters. For 4 seconds, nobody said anything. The contact on the lower slopes continued for another 6 minutes, and then ended in the decisive way that contacts end when suppressive fire has successfully degraded the attacking force's willingness to stay in the engagement. The valley went quiet in the careful incremental way it always goes quiet after violence. First the automatic weapons, then the smaller arms, then individual shots, then nothing but the ringing in the ears and the sound of controlled breathing. Tessa was beside Reeves before the last shot had fully faded. She had set the Barrett down behind her with the same deliberate care she had used to pick it up, and she did not look back at it, and she did not look at the team members beginning to register what they had just witnessed. She was focused on Reeves. He was still conscious, which was good. His color had not improved, which was not. "Talk to me." "Still here," he said. "Good, keep talking. Tell me something boring." He told her about a road trip he had taken in high school. She listened to the words and to what the words were telling her beneath their surface. The pace of them, the effort they required, the way the voice changed when the body was working harder than it wanted to admit. She adjusted the tourniquet. She started an IV with the efficiency of someone for whom this had long since stopped being a procedure and become simply a thing she did with her hands. Briggs was 2 meters away, sitting up, his right arm held against his chest. He was watching her. His expression was not the expression he had worn for the past 5 days. It was something without a precise name, the expression of a man whose map has just been revealed as wrong and who does not yet have a replacement, but has stopped pretending the old one is accurate. The team moved to the secondary rally point, a shallow depression in the rock face, 160 meters northeast, deep enough for cover, familiar enough from prior reconnaissance to require no discussion. They carried Reeves between them. Tessa walked alongside him, maintaining pressure, monitoring the IV line, watching the things she watched because watching them was the one, and the quad did not pause because the environment was uncomfortable. The depression smelled of cold rock and the particular mineral sharpness of altitude. The team settled into it and conducted the silent internal inventory that operators conduct after contact. What they had lost, what the gap between those two things meant for what came next. Cahill got on the radio to the Tactical Operations Center at FOB Wright. What came back was interference, not natural interference. The kind with a consistency to it, a pattern, the specific quality of signal being actively degraded rather than merely blocked by geography. He tried twice more. The same result each time. He lowered the radio and looked at Voss. Neither of them said what they were both thinking, because saying it required following the thought to its conclusion, and the conclusion was one that neither of them was ready to process in the same moment they were managing a casualty in a compromised position, and the recent discovery that the mission they had been briefed was considerably more complicated than it had been presented. Voss sat down beside Tessa. She was working on Reeves, still the small, constant maintenance of a situation that was stable but not secure. In the pale light of a partially covered chemical glow stick, her hands moved with the same economy they always moved with. No wasted motion, no performance of urgency. Just the thing itself done correctly in the time it required. Voss watched her hands for a moment. Then he said quietly, "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" She did not look up. "My father." "Tell me about him." Her hands continued their work. "Gunnery Sergeant Raymond Calloway, Force Recon, 2 tours Iraq, 2 tours Afghanistan." A pause. KIA, Kunar Province, April 2007. Voss looked at the covered glow stick. "I know," he said. She looked up at him, not quickly, with the deliberation she used for most things. "You knew him," she said. "We operated together, not on his last deployment. Before that." He looked at his hands for a moment. "He was one of the best men I have known, in this work or anywhere else." She held his eyes for a few seconds. Then she went back to Reeves. Cahill had moved to the far edge of the depression and was speaking to Voss in the low voice he used when he was working through something requiring precision. Tessa could hear them without appearing to listen. "Gunny Raymond Calloway, Force Recon." "Yes, sir." "You knew him?" "Yes, sir." A longer pause. "Does she know why she's really here specifically?" Voss was quiet long enough that the silence answered before he did. "No," he said. "Not all of it." Cahill studied Tessa's back across the depression. She was talking quietly to Reeves, monitoring his responses, doing the work. He studied her the way he studied most things, carefully without reaching a conclusion, faster than the evidence warranted. Then he looked back at Voss. "Tell her." Voss reached into the inner pocket of his kit, not the outer pockets holding operational gear, but the flat inner one pressed against his chest, where operators keep the things they cannot afford to lose, and removed a folded section of heavy paper. Water-stained. The folds opened and refolded many times with the careful frequency of something consulted often. The paper had the color of age and the texture of a document that had lived close to a human body for years, absorbing its heat and its history. He set it beside Tessa without announcing what it was. She looked at it. She looked at him. She unfolded it. A hand-drawn map. Precise pencil lines with measurement notations in the margins, directional indicators, and the specific symbols she had been taught to read at a kitchen table in Montana when she was 12 years old. The geography it described was this valley, this district. The ground they were currently occupying, rendered from memory and observation by someone who had walked it, and depended on that understanding for his life. In the lower right corner, in lettering she knew as well as she knew her own, 2005. R. Calloway, Site, USMC. Her father had made this map. In 2005, 2 years before the door. 2 years before the hallway and the promise, and the 4 years of reconstruction that had led her here. She turned it over. On the back at larger scale was a detailed rendering she did not immediately recognize, but the symbols within it she did. She had been taught those symbols at that same kitchen table with the same methodical patience her father applied to everything he considered important. Minefields, PMN-2 anti-personnel, M14. The Soviet-era devices distributed through this region in the 1980s and quietly multiplying through the soil ever since. Her father had mapped them. He had walked this specific ground in 2005 and mapped the minefields in this area with the detail of someone who intended the map to be useful to someone else at a later date. At the bottom of the back page below the minefield diagram, a single line of text. 6 words in his particular combination of printed and cursive. "If you're here, trust your hands." She read it 3 times. She understood now why he had taught her to read them. Not as general knowledge, not as precaution, as preparation. He had known he might not come back from Kunar. He had known it in the way experienced men develop a kind of long-range weather sense about certain assignments, not certainty, but a probability demanding to be taken seriously. And he had done what he always did with information that mattered. He had transferred it to the person he trusted most in the form that would survive him. He had given her the key before she knew there was a lock. She folded the map, placed it inside her shirt against her skin, where it would stay until she needed it. She did not cry. She had not cried at the funeral, which had confused people who did not understand that grief and control are not opposing forces but the same force directed differently. What she felt now was not something that required release. It was something that required action. The feeling of a door opening that had been closed for 4 years, and what was on the other side was not comfort or resolution, but simply the next thing she was supposed to do. Reeves said from the ground, "Doc." "I'm here," she said. "You good?" She looked at him. "I'm good," she said. "How are you, Buckram?" "Leg hurts." "That is the appropriate response," she said, "to what your leg has been through." Despite the location and the circumstances, in the blood, in the darkness, the corner of his mouth moved. New intelligence arrived at 0347 hours through a secondary channel Voss had established using equipment from his personal kit rather than the compromised standard communications. It came from the team's liaison officer at Bagram, who had been monitoring the situation and had accessed information that made the picture suddenly unambiguously clear. The coordinate leak enabling the ambush did not originate with anyone in Task Unit Bravo. It originated at FOB Wright, specifically with the DIA intelligence officer, who had joined the mission briefing by secure video link. The man who had provided the intelligence about Karimi's true identity. The man who had known every operational parameter of the mission because he had been briefed into every operational parameter of the mission. The man who had at some point prior to this deployment made arrangements with the network he was nominally helping to dismantle. The communications jamming was his as well. There would be no quick reaction force from Wright, not because no one had called for one, because the call was not getting through, and the reason it was not getting through was the same reason the team's position had been anticipated and the same reason 7 Americans had died from strikes too precise to be coincidental. Cahill absorbed this with the stillness of a man who has learned that visible reaction to bad news is a form of spending he cannot afford when all resources are needed elsewhere. He sat with it for 30 seconds. Then he began to think about what it changed and what it did not. What it changed the assumption that external support was coming. What it did not change Karimi's location. The compound at Nawabad North, 3 kilometers northeast, which according to pre-mission intelligence remained his operating base. The original mission objective. The fact that Cody Reeves needed evacuation at a rate the current situation was not providing. Voss had been working the same problem from a different angle. "There's a secondary sniper position," he said. "Northern slope. Quiet since Calloway took the eastern one, but he's there. I've been tracking his pattern for 20 minutes. Distance? 1100, maybe 12. Cahill looked at Tessa. She was aware of the look without turning to meet it. She had been following the conversation, integrating it with what she already knew and what the map against her chest implied and what Reeves's current condition required. She finished adjusting the IV line. She stood. She looked at the Barrett where Briggs had set it carefully against the rock wall. She picked it up. Briggs watched her. He said nothing. But the expression on his face had shifted again, had become more legible, less confused. He was watching someone do something that he had spent his career believing only certain people could do, and the evidence in front of him was in the process of revising his understanding of who those people were. She set the bipod, adjusted the scope for the increased distance, read the wind not just at her position, but at the intermediate points she could assess from the vegetation pattern on the slope and the movement of dust in the valley below. She built a model of what the air was doing between herself and the position Voss had identified. 1,180 meters, different from the first shot. Not just in distance, but in geometry. The northern slope presented a different angle, and the wind at that elevation was doing something more complex than it had been doing an hour earlier, and the pre-dawn temperature drop had created a density gradient in the air requiring its own accounting. She accounted for it. She found the position, tracked the pattern Voss had described, and confirmed it with her own observation. Waited for the moment when the pattern was in the part of its cycle offering the highest probability. She breathed. She did not rush. Rushing was a form of imprecision. Imprecision at 1,180 meters was a form of failure. Failure was not something she had come to Kanar to do. The moment arrived. She fired once. The northern slope went still. She lowered the rifle. Set it down with the same deliberate care she always used. Turned back to Reeves. Briggs said her name. Not Doc. Her name. She looked at him. "I said things," he said. "The first couple days." He stopped. He was not a man accustomed to this particular type of sentence, and it showed clearly. "They were wrong, what I said." She looked at him for a moment. "I know," she said. "I'm sorry." She held his eyes long enough for the apology to occupy the space it deserved. Then she nodded once and returned to her patient. Briggs let out a breath that had been accumulating for some time. Voss caught his eye and said nothing. But the look said that was the right thing. You got there. Cahill was working the secondary channel again, building his bridge from available materials, looking for the options that were always present if you kept looking long enough. He found one. It would take time more than was comfortable given Reeves's condition, but less than the alternative, which was waiting for something that was not coming. He looked across the depression at Tessa, who was doing what she always did when she had time, keeping Reeves talking, monitoring his responses, maintaining the situation with the steady, unhurried attention of someone who had made a private decision about the outcome and intended to enforce it. He had told her to stay at the rear. He had told her she was the medic. She was the medic. That part remained accurate. She was also something else, something that did not fit cleanly into the standard organization of things, something for which the forms did not have an adequate box. Her father had known what she was. He had spent years making sure she knew it too. 3 kilometers northeast behind a minefield that Raymond Calloway had mapped in 2005, and his daughter now carried against her chest a man named Rashid Karimi, was in a compound the mission had been designed to reach and had not yet reached. The night was not over. Tessa Calloway, sitting in a depression in the rock of the Hindu Kush, with her hands on a patient she had decided would survive, was already thinking about what came next. She was thinking about the map. She was thinking about the ground. She did not know the number yet. She would count them later, each step deliberate and specific, owned entirely by knowledge her father had given her at a kitchen table in Montana when she was 12 years old. She would count all 41, and she would remember everyone. The intelligence that came through Voss's secondary channel at 0412 hours was not complicated. The simplest facts are often the most consequential, and what the Bagram liaison communicated in 4 sentences was simply this. Cody Reeves had a window of approximately 20 minutes before the blood volume he had lost, despite the tourniquet and everything Tessa had done and continued to do, would push him past the threshold where her skills and her equipment and her intentions would be sufficient to hold him on the right side of it. 20 minutes. Long enough if the distance was manageable. The casualty collection point was 40 meters west, accessible without obstruction, provided the slope was clear. The eastern ridgeline was clear. The northern slope was clear. Moving Reeves there was operationally viable, except for the minefield. Voss had flagged it during the movement, noted it internally without raising it on the radio, because flagging it would have required explaining it, and explaining it would have cost time they did not have in the middle of contact. He raised it now. He described it to Cahill in the specific compressed language of men who share a technical vocabulary built over years of working the same type of ground. 38 meters across, running parallel to the compound's eastern perimeter wall, positioned to discourage exactly the kind of approach the team's revised route required. Not recently placed, the devices had been in the ground long enough to settle and shift in the ways old mines settle and shift, which meant their positions were not precisely predictable from the outside. Not to most people. Cahill looked at the minefield. He looked at his team. 4 functional operators, 1 casualty, 1 corpsman, 1 compromised communications channel, and a QRF not coming from right and coming from elsewhere on a timeline that was not 20 minutes. He looked at Tessa. She was already looking at the minefield. She had been looking at it for several minutes in the way she looked at things when she was reading them, rather than simply observing. The patient systematic rolling assessment her father had installed in her before she understood what it was for. Reading the ground the way he had taught her the moisture differential in soil that indicates where something has displaced the earth and where the earth has subsequently tried and failed to fully close over the displacement. The vegetation disturbance telling its story about what lay beneath. The way the pre-dawn light caught the surface at the angle revealing the most to someone who knew what they were looking for. She had the map against her chest. She had been thinking about the map, specifically about what it said, about the ground, about the placement patterns her father had recorded in 2005, about the device types he had notated and the spacing he had indicated. The compounds in this district had used the same approaches to perimeter defense for decades because the terrain constrained the options, and constrained options produced predictable solutions. Her father had walked this ground. He had looked at what she was looking at, he had drawn it, and then he had taught her at a kitchen table in Montana how to read it. Cahill said quietly, "We need another way in." Voss said, "There isn't one. Not in the time we have." Cahill looked at the minefield and ran the arithmetic that commanders run. In moments like this, the calculation of risk and resource and probability that has no clean answer because none of the inputs are clean. His face showed nothing because showing anything would cost the team something they needed to keep. We wait for QRF, he said. Bagram is working the timeline. Voss said, Reeves doesn't have the timeline. Nobody spoke for a moment. Tessa stood up. She stood from beside Reeves with the unhurried deliberation of someone who has finished making a decision and is now moving through its execution. She checked the tourniquet one final time, checked the IV line, said something to Reeves quietly, and whatever she said produced in his face a brief visible of steadying shade, kind that comes from being told by someone you trust that the situation is manageable. She took the map from inside her shirt. She looked at it for 20 seconds. Not reading it, she had been reading it continuously in the part of her mind that runs beneath whatever else is happening. She was confirming, aligning memory with what she could see from where she stood. She folded it and returned it to her shirt. She removed her outer jacket and held it in her hands for a moment, then began tearing it along the seams into strips. Narrow uniform, each one roughly the length of her hand. Cahill watched her. Calloway. Sir, what are you doing? She looked at him directly as she always did when she wanted to be unambiguous. There's a way through, she said. PMN2 placement pattern from 2005, my father's annotation. The M14s will have shifted, but the PMN2s are deep enough that their positions remain consistent with the original map. The spacing is predictable once you know the pattern. I can read the surface variations in this light. Cahill looked at the minefield. He looked at her. He was a man who had spent his career making decisions under conditions that did not permit certainty, and he understood at a precise cellular level what she was proposing and what it required and what happened if any single variable in the chain was not what she believed it to be. You'll die out there, he said. He did not say it as dismissal, not as command. He said it the way a man says something true that he needs to say because not saying it would be its own kind of failure. She held his eyes. My father taught me this specific ground, she said, this specific minefield. He did not do that, so I would stand on the safe side of it. Cahill said nothing. Voss said nothing. Briggs, sitting with his arm against his chest, was looking at the ground between his boots with the expression of a man who has already made his accounting and found something he did not expect on the ledger. Cahill looked at Reeves. Reeves was watching Tessa with the expression of a man who understands that his life is held in someone else's decision and has made a complete and uncomplicated peace with whose hands those are. Cahill looked back at her. He did not give her permission. He did not tell her no. She turned toward the minefield. She stood at its edge for a full 30 seconds before she took the first step. Not hesitation. Hesitation belongs to decisions not yet fully made. This was the final calibration of a system about to be asked to perform at the limit of its capability, and she was giving it the time it required. She was reading the ground the way her father had taught her, not point by point, which exhausts the reader and starts producing misses, but in the continuous rolling read that treats the earth as a text and the reader as someone fluent in its language. She read the moisture pattern the way pre-dawn ground holds darkness differently in the places where something has displaced it and where the displacement has never fully healed, because earth over a buried object compresses in a way that changes its relationship with water. She read the vegetation the way the small tough ground cover at this elevation bends in directions it does not naturally bend when something beneath it is influencing its root system. She read the surface texture, the microtopography that looks uniform from distance, but resolves up close and in the right light into a record of everything ever done to it. She held her father's map in her mind, each notation aligned with what she was seeing in front of her. First step, left foot, heel first, feeling the ground's give before committing weight. The earth accepted it without objection. She placed the first fabric strip at the entry point. Second step, right foot angled slightly left because the direct line passed over a patch, showing the subtle circular compression of a PMN2 that had been in place long enough to settle, but not long enough to be forgotten by the earth above it. Third step. Fourth, she moved with the deliberate continuous rhythm of reading and moving simultaneously, the reading always one step ahead of the moving the mind, always holding the next placement while the body executed the current one. Step 7. She stopped. Not because of what was beneath her feet, because of what was in front of her eyes, a section of ground where the moisture pattern was wrong in a way requiring a moment to interpret correctly. The PMN2S in that section had shifted. Not dramatically, perhaps 30 centimeters. But at this scale of work, 30 centimeters was the difference between the path and what the path was designed to avoid. She read it, recalculated, took step 8 at an angle that appeared from a distance entirely arbitrary. It was not arbitrary. Behind her in the depression, nobody spoke. Voss watched her with the absolute stillness of a man who understands that the only contribution available to him in this moment is to not disrupt it. Briggs watched her. Even Reeves on the ground had turned his head to keep her back in sight as she moved away through the pre-dawn gray. Step 11, step 12. She placed a marker at the halfway point where the path changed direction slightly to account for a cluster of M14S she identified not by the devices themselves, plastic shallow, nearly invisible, but by the pattern of small disturbances in the ground cover at the points of insertion. M14ES were planted differently than P-M and 2S. The men who placed them were often in a hurry, and hurry leaves traces. The ground cover pushed aside does not immediately return to its original orientation. The stems bend in the direction they were pushed, and in morning light at the right angle, the bend is visible to someone who knows to look for it. She saw the bend. She stepped around it. Step 17, 18, step 19. She stopped. Right foot on the ground. Left foot suspended in mid-transfer weight, committed to a direction she suddenly understood was not the right direction. The PMN2 was 5 centimeters from the outside edge of her right boot. She could not see the device itself. What she saw was the absence of certain features that should have been present if the ground there was undisturbed. The moisture pattern, the microtexture, the way the light was not catching the surface the way it caught the surface of the ground on either side. Her father had called this the negative signature, not the presence of something, but the absence of what should normally be there, which is harder to see but more reliable once you learn to read it. She was very still. She breathed out. Not a deliberate technique, just the body doing what it does when the option of rushing has been entirely removed, and what remains is only the present moment in its complete and unambiguous specificity. She shifted her weight backward, fractionally returning it to her right heel. Moved her left foot not forward but sideways 6 inches, testing the ground with the patient care of someone who has decided that time has become secondary to accuracy. The ground there held. She transferred her weight, moved her right foot, placed the marker, kept moving. Step 23, 27, 30, step 31. Sound from the northern approach, not the position she had engaged, but a secondary element working around the northern perimeter of the contact zone. Not many of them, but armed and close enough that the sound of movement reached the depression where Voss and Briggs were positioned. She heard it. She kept moving. Behind her, she heard Voss and Briggs reposition to address the contact, creating noise and movement designed to pull the new threat's attention toward the depression and away from the small figure currently crossing ground that should have been impassable. The sounds behind her resolved into the controlled, deliberate language of men doing their jobs, and she filed it in the part of her mind tracking things she could not address right now and continued doing the things she could. Step 34, 36, 38, step 41. She stepped off the far edge of the minefield onto undisturbed ground. She stood there for a moment. She did not look back immediately. She looked at the compound wall 20 meters ahead, the secondary perimeter lower than the main wall, with the narrow gate giving access to the section of the compound where pre-mission intelligence indicated Karimi's inner guard staged their equipment. Then she looked back at the minefield she had just crossed. The fabric markers were visible in the growing light, a line of pale strips threading through 38 meters of ground containing things designed to end her. She counted them, now looking back at the line she had walked. 41. She turned toward the compound gate. The 2 men inside the secondary perimeter were not expecting anyone from the minefield side. This was entirely understandable. Nobody came from the minefield side. The minefield was the architectural statement that made a human guard in that direction unnecessary. The first man saw her at 4 meters. That distance was too short for the reaction time required to raise a weapon from a resting carry to a firing position. A fact about human physiology that has nothing to do with the quality of the man encountering it, and everything to do with the mathematics of how quickly a nervous system can process visual information, route it through the decision-making structures, and return a motor response to the hands. She was inside that mathematics before he completed the process. 8 seconds. 2 men. The silence of the secondary perimeter afterward was complete. She moved through the gate and into the low corridor beyond it without stopping. The secondary structure flagged in pre-mission intelligence as a staging area for Karimi's inner guard ran along the eastern interior wall. She cleared it in 90 seconds. Empty. Whatever had been staged here had been moved recently. She came back to the gate and turned to face the minefield. The pale strips of fabric were visible from here, threading through the ground she had walked. She keyed her radio. Path is marked and clear. Bring Reeves through. Step exactly on the markers. Do not deviate. Voss's voice came back in 2 words. Copy that. She watched them come. Voss and Trant carrying Reeves between them, Briggs moving behind managing his weapon with his functional arm, all of them placing their feet with the careful precision of men who understood exactly what the ground around them contained. They moved through her marked path with the concentrated deliberateness of a procession, each step intentional, nothing wasted. 4 minutes. When the last of them stepped off the far end onto the ground inside the secondary perimeter, Trant exhaled a sound that was not quite a word, but contained everything a word would have. She was already on her knees beside Reeves. "You're still here," she said. "Told you," he said. His voice was thin but steady, with the determination of someone refusing to be unconscious through sheer force of will. "QRF has a timeline," Voss said from behind her. He was on the secondary channel Bagram Liaison, the link that existed in no official documentation. 20 minutes. "He has 20 minutes, she said. "Make sure they're ready." She heard Voss relay this and heard the controlled exchange of men coordinating the mechanics of extraction across distance. She kept her hands where they needed to be. The door at the far end of the corridor opened. She did not reach for her weapon immediately. The sound was not of a door being forced, it was of a door being opened by someone who knew where the handle was and had used it before. She noted the distinction, came to her feet, and drew the M9 in the same motion, placing herself between the door and Reeves. 3 men came through. The 2 in front were armed and positioned with the practiced spacing of men who had performed this kind of entry many times. The man behind them was not armed. Late 40s, lean in the local dress of the region, moving with the unhurried authority of someone who had decided that the outcome of the next 60 seconds depended on how he presented himself and had made a considered choice. He stopped when he saw her. His eyes moved to the M9, to her face, then to something lower, to the medical bag set beside Reeves, its outer pocket open, the contents partially visible. And among those contents, clipped to the outer fabric by a piece of safety wire she had threaded through the attachment loop 9 years ago and never removed, was a small metal patch. Worn, the enamel rubbed soft in 2 places from handling. The eagle anchor and trident of naval special warfare, but not her insignia, smaller, older, belonging to a specific person and recognizable as such to someone who had seen it before. He looked at it for 3 seconds. He raised his left hand. The 2 men behind him lowered their weapons. "You are Raymond Calloway's daughter," he said, not a question. She kept the M9 level. "Who are you?" "My name is Rashid Karimi." He said it without weight, without drama, as simple identification, the name of a man introducing himself to someone he had been expecting without knowing when she would arrive. "Your father served in this district. March of 2005. His reconnaissance element moved into a monitoring zone my unit controlled in the northern section of Nawabad." He paused. She said nothing, her aim held. "One man," he continued, "separated from his element in an engagement earlier that day. Injured, not critically, but enough that movement was difficult." A pause. "He was carrying a child, a girl not more than 3 years old, recovered from a collapsed structure. He was moving toward the nearest village with medical capability. Through terrain I had operational control over." Voss had come to stand at her left shoulder. She felt him without looking away from Karimi. "I gave the order not to fire," Karimi said. "My men believed it was a tactical calculation. It was not. It was the recognition of something that has no military designation, but that I have encountered rarely enough in my life to know it when I see it." He held her eyes. "I have thought about that decision many times in the years since. I have not regretted it." He reached inside his clothing. Voss's hand moved. Karimi moved slowly, deliberately, producing a folded document, dense with handwritten entries organized in columns, and held it toward Voss without looking at him, his eyes remaining on Tessa. "The network contact structure," he said. "Every operational node, communication protocols, handler identities on both sides of the arrangement, including the officer currently at FOB Wright, who has been providing movement intelligence for 2 years." He looked at Voss directly for the first time. "Take it, use it, dismantle what has been built with it." Voss took the document, opened it far enough to assess its nature, looked at Karimi. "Why?" Voss said. "One word." Karimi considered it. "Because the people I have been working with have become something I agreed to work with in a different era for reasons that no longer exist. And because the work being done in my name has no longer anything to do with what I told myself I was doing when I started." He looked at Tessa one more time. Your father raised someone worth knowing. I could see that the moment you walked in here, the way you moved, the way you assessed, the way you kept working while we spoke, because the man on the floor is more important than this conversation. He would have done exactly the same. He turned. He walked through the door into the corridor toward the compound's northern exit. The two armed men went with him. Their footsteps receded and were gone. Nobody stopped him. Voss looked at Tessa. She lowered the M9, holstered it, went back to Reeves. Tell me something boring, she said. Again. Again. He talked. She listened with the part of her mind that monitored what words were telling her beneath their surface, and she kept her hands where her hands needed to be, and the minutes passed the way difficult time passes slowly at first and then all at once. The QRF arrived at 0511 hours. Not from FOB right. Voss's secondary channel contact at Bagram had escalated through SEAL Team 3's commanding officer, directly bypassing the compromised chain entirely. And what came off the two Black Hawks that settled onto the flat ground northwest of the compound was a six-man element and two additional medics with equipment prepared for casualties. The lead medic came off the ramp at a run, 22 years old, second deployment. He moved through the secondary perimeter, following Trant through the gate past the line of pale fabric strips still lying in the dirt and into the structure. He saw Reeves. He moved to Reeves. He assessed what had been done, the tourniquet, the IV, the positioning, the record of Reeves's vitals at measured intervals in Tessa's small notebook, and the assessment showed in his face as something between relief and a particular quality of professional respect that has no adequate shorthand. Then he looked at the person who had done it. Tessa was sitting with her back against the wall to the right of the door. Her left shoulder had been treated. She had treated it herself at some point in the previous 2 hours, cleaning and packing the wound with the same dispassion she applied to everything else. Her jacket was gone, converted into the markers still lying in the dirt outside. There was blood on her hands that was not entirely hers. She was looking at the middle distance with the expression of someone present, but also very far away, processing something too large to process quickly and placed in a queue requiring time. He looked at her for a moment. She sensed it and came back. She looked at him, and she smiled. Not a large smile, not a performance. The specific, quiet expression of someone who has done what they came to do and arrived at the other side of it and finds the other side, while not simple, exactly where they are supposed to be. The expression of someone who has just completed a conversation that began at a kitchen table in Montana 14 years ago, when a man she loved drew diagrams on graph paper and said, "This is what you might need someday. Trust your hands." The young medic would try for years to describe it accurately. He would come closest when he said she looked like someone who had always been going exactly there. The debrief at Bagram lasted 6 hours. The DIA officer, whose name appeared in Karimi's document, was placed in custody within 90 minutes of the QRF's return. The process of unwinding what he had built took considerably longer months, handled by people above the operational level whose names would not appear in any accessible document. Reeves came out of surgery at 1340 hours. The femoral artery had required repair under general anesthesia performed by a vascular surgeon who had been working trauma in this theater for 2 years. He said afterward that the pre-surgical management had been exceptionally well executed and that a different standard of field care would likely have produced a different outcome. Reeves was in recovery for 4 hours. When he came around fully, the first thing he registered was Cahill in the chair beside his bed, the expression of a man who had been there for a while. The second was Tessa standing at the foot of the bed reading something in her small notebook. He looked at her. She looked up. "Doc," he said, anesthesia still thick and the words coming slower than he intended. "Reeves." He was quiet, assembling memory. The contact, the ground, the tourniquet, the darkness, her voice telling him to keep talking while she kept him alive with her hands in the dark. "You dragged me out alive," he said. She held his eyes. "That's the job," she said. He shook his head slightly against the pillow. "No," he said. "That's more than the job." She said nothing, but she closed the notebook and set it on the bed beside his hand, and the gesture said what she did not say out loud. "Yes, you're right about that." Cahill stood when she moved to leave. He stepped outside the room with her into the corridor, smelling of antiseptic and recycled air, and stood with her in the particular silence that exists between people who have been through something together that has not yet been fully named. "I told you you'd die out there," he said. "Yes, sir." He was quiet. "I was wrong," he said. "You were working with the information you had," she said. "It was a reasonable assessment." He looked at her. He did not accept the absolution she was offering because he was a man who did not take absolution he hadn't earned, and what he was working out in that corridor was exactly what he had earned and what he had not. He had told her to stay at the rear. He had been wrong. That was the accurate accounting, and he was a man who valued accuracy above the comfort of its absence. Your father, he said. What Karimi told you. I'm working on it, she said. There are people to contact. Channels that exist for this kind of thing. I'll help, he said. I know people at that level. I'll make the calls. She looked at him. I know, he said simply. She held his eyes for a moment. She nodded once, the kind of nod that contains more than the movement itself. Briggs was in the corridor when she turned. He had been there long enough that she understood he had heard the exchange with Cahill and chosen not to interrupt it. He had something in his hand. He held it out to her. His trident patch. The gold and silver insignia worn on the uniform as identification and as the specific symbol of what it had cost to be here, doing this work in this place. The metal was worn in the way things wear when they have been handled, often touched in the unconscious way that people touch objects carrying weight. She looked at it, she looked at him. He said nothing. What needed saying had been said the night before in 4 words. This was something after the words, the gesture that words cannot carry. She took it. She held it in her palm and looked at it for a moment. Then she placed it in the pocket over her heart where it sat with the weight of what it represented, which was not a small weight and was not intended to be. Briggs gave her one nod. She gave him one back. They were finished with each other's debts. 6 months later, Quantico, Virginia, March. The kind of cold the eastern seaboard produces in the shoulder between winter and spring, insistent and gray, settling into the gaps between buildings. The room held 18 people, corpsmen, mostly Navy, a few Army medics cross-assigned to the program. They ranged from 20 years old to 31, and they shared the alert, evaluating quality of people who had already decided that what they were about to learn was worth learning, but had not yet been shown why. Tessa Calloway stood at the front of the room. She was 26 years old. The dark circles under her eyes had faded in the months since Kunar. She had gained back the weight she had lost to the deployment's accumulated attrition. The left shoulder moved normally, which the surgeon at Bagram had told her was the better of 2 possible outcomes. She had designed this program herself. Integrated combat medicine, 16 weeks. The curriculum addressed what she had identified through 4 years of fieldwork and one specific night in the Kunar Valley as the foundational failure in how the military trained its medical personnel, the assumption that medical competence and tactical competence were separate disciplines requiring separate practitioners, when what the field actually required was someone capable of moving between them without transition costs, because the field did not pause while you reorganized yourself. Both hands. That was the program, not as a slogan, as the practical, specific, executable reality of what a corpsman in a forward combat environment actually needed to be. Cody Reeves was in the front row, not as a student, invited as what she had been careful to call a subject matter expert on the patient experience of advanced field medicine, which was accurate and also a way of saying she wanted him here, that his presence mattered, that the line from a tourniquet in the dark to this room of 18 people going into the field better prepared was a line she wanted him to be part of. He walked without a limp now. The vascular repair had been complete, the physical therapy aggressive, and he had approached both with the focused energy that Tessa had come to understand was simply his baseline, applied uniformly to whatever problem was currently in front of him. Eli Trant sat in the second row assisting with the program. The TBI she had caught on that valley floor had been fully treated and had left no lasting effects, a fact that the neurologist at Bagram had called fortunate and that Tessa understood was fortunate in direct proportion to the fact that it had been caught when it was. She called her mother on a Tuesday evening in early March, sitting in her quarters with the window cracked for the cold air she had come to prefer for sleeping. Her mother answered on the second ring, the voice containing the note of a woman who has been carrying a particular kind of patience for a long time and has become very good at it. They talked about ordinary things first. This was their way approaching the center through the periphery, the oblique path to what needed saying. Her mother said, "Are you eating?" She said, "Yes." Her mother said, "Are you sleeping?" She said, "Better than before." Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then, "You sound different." "I feel different." Another pause longer. Her mother said, "Did you keep your promise?" She looked at the ceiling, at the texture of the paint and the way the single lamp on her desk was catching it. She thought about a hallway, a door. 21 years old in the absolute simplicity of grief before it becomes complicated by everything that follows. "I had to break it," she said, To bring someone home. Her mother did not respond immediately. When she did, her voice was the voice of a woman who has spent years building a structure around a wound and has learned to carry that structure without letting it become the thing she is. Your father would have said the same thing, her mother said. She closed her eyes. I know, she said. They stayed on the line for a while longer, not saying very much, which was its own kind of saying. When she set the phone down, the room felt different in the way rooms feel after a conversation that has closed something that needed closing. She looked at the notebook on her desk, at the schedule pinned to the wall beside it. Tomorrow, physical training at 0500, curriculum review with Reeves and Trant at 0730, 18 students in the classroom at 0900. Beneath those entries, in the handwriting of the duty officer who had slid the paper under her door that afternoon, mission brief FOB, Sharana, 0800 Thursday. Report to J3. She looked at that line for a moment. She picked up the folded map from her desk, her father's map, the one she had carried against her chest, through a minefield and carried in her hands through everything that followed. She folded it with the careful deliberateness she used for things that mattered and placed it in her medical bag. Not in an outer pocket, in the inner one closest to her. She was ready. On Wednesday, she stood at the front of the room with 18 faces paying the kind of attention that belongs to people who have decided this matters. She picked up the marker. She wrote 4 words on the board. Drag them out alive. She turned back to the room. Your job, she said, is not to wait until the shooting stops. Your job is not to stay in the rear and be available when it's safe. Your job is to be there in the moment, in the ground in the decision, and to have both hands ready for whatever the next 10 seconds requires. She paused. Medical or tactical, whichever is needed, whichever comes first. You don't get to choose the order. She looked at Reeves, who had turned slightly in his seat so she could see his face. He gave her a single small nod. This program exists, she said, because of a night in Kunar province, when those 2 things had to happen at the same time, and there was one person in the right position to do both of them. She set the marker down. That person should not have been exceptional. That should be the standard. That is what we are building here. She looked at the 18 faces. We begin, she said. 3 days later, at 0800 on a Thursday morning, she walked into a J3 briefing room at Bagram Airfield with her medical bag over her left shoulder, the Force Recon patch clipped to its outer pocket, where it had always been, and took a seat at the table. The room held 7 people she had not met and 2 she had. Cahill was one of them. He looked at her when she came in and nodded once. She nodded back. The second face she recognized was Voss, sitting at the far end of the table with the expression of a man who has been in enough of these rooms to know that this one is going to matter. He looked at her. Something in his face said, we are not finished. There is more to find, and I will help you find it. He did not say this aloud because it was not the time and because some things are communicated more accurately without words between people who have learned to read the language that lives beneath them. She understood. The duty officer closed the door. She opened her notebook to a clean page. She was ready. Outside, the mountains held their silence, as they always had, as they always would. They had seen this before, the small figures at their feet, armed with their training and their histories, and the things the people who loved them had given them before the door, before the hallway, before all of it. They had seen it, and they would see it again. But they had seen something this September that they had not seen before. A woman who walked 41 steps through ground that should have ended her, guided by the hands of a man who had loved her enough to prepare her for the worst day of her life and trusted her completely and without reservation to find her way through. Trust your hands, he had written. She had.